Hi ladies, so we left off in the last set of notes kind of talking about Shays' Rebellion, and we're still wrapping up that topic in class. And what we addressed was the fact that Shays' Rebellion really highlighted the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation kind of as an ineffective form of government. And so we're going to have a convention called, as shown in the end of the documentary, to help make changes to the current government in the United States to improve it. And this is where we're going to get the written form of government that we have today. So this meeting was called the Philadelphia Convention because it was held in Philadelphia, but it's also going to become known as the Constitutional Convention because it's where we're going to get the Constitution. Delegates from every state attended the convention except for Rhode Island. Rhode Island did not attend. George Washington was selected to be the president over the convention itself, which you also saw in the documentary. There really was no other man for this job besides Washington to kind of unite the states into agreement that the Constitution needed to be changed, or the government needed to be changed. The initial idea was, let's just revise the Articles and make them better, but the Articles of Confederation were just a bigger problem than you could imagine, and so they abandoned that idea to edit them and decided, let's just kind of scrap them and start over and form a brand new plan of government. James Madison is kind of chosen to write down the final plans for the Constitution. He didn't come up with every idea by himself, but because he's the primary writer, he is going to become known as the father of the Constitution. But it wasn't that easy just to devise a whole new plan, because there are several issues or disagreements between the states that kind of need to be worked out and compromised on before we can have an agreement on the Constitution and the new form of government. So the first kind of issue we see is a debate between small and large states. And by small and large, I don't mean like physical size, but actual population. More populated versus lesser populated states. So the issue that they're having is an argument over representation in Congress. How do we determine how many representatives a state gets? Obviously, the larger states are going to be in favor of representation being based on population because it will get them more votes. But the lesser populated states are going to be against that plan because they feel that they will then unfairly be heard in Congress if they get fewer votes just because they have less people living in their state, so their state will have less of a say. So the two sides officially that are presented, we have the Virginia plan being favored by the larger states, and then you have the New Jersey plan being favored by the smaller states. The Virginia plan suggested that representation be decided by population and that you were to have two different houses in Congress. This would be called a bicameral legislature. But Virginia plan is suggesting that both houses be based on population, while New Jersey is saying there should only be one congressional house and all states should just get one vote and just keep it fair and square that way. This plan would be resolved with what is known as the Great Compromise. We do end up getting a bicameral legislature, so there would be two houses, and each house will reflect one of the plans. So, for example, today, we do have the House and the Senate in Congress, okay, aka bicameral legislature, and the Senate has two representatives no matter what the population. Every state gets two senators, so that favors the New Jersey plan, whereas the House of Representatives is a congressional house that's based on population, meaning states with larger amounts of people living in them have more representatives than states that are lesser less populated. That's the Great Compromise. The next issue is between the North and the South. And this is over the issue of slavery. Northern states are starting to move away from slavery in their economy. They are kind of starting to oppose slavery, and quite frankly, they don't really need it as much as the southern colonies do, as the southern colonies are so heavily influenced with agriculture still. And to the South, slavery is very important to their economy. One compromise they actually have to come up with in the beginning is deciding, are they going to abolish slavery or not? And the South is definitely not ready for that to happen at this point. And what they decide at this constitutional convention is that the Atlantic slave trade will be allowed to exist for 20 more years. And then after that, it would be abolished by Congress. Now, that's just talking about the slave trade itself, coming from, over the Atlantic Ocean, coming off the continent of Africa. That's not talking about the institution of slavery from within the colonies. So they will have to decide later if they're going to abolish slavery as a whole. But what they're saying for now is, okay, the slave trade within triangular trade, that is only going to be allowed to exist for 20 more years, and then we're going to abolish it. But the second issue that they have at the convention involving slavery is the issue of representation. Okay, so since slavery is still going to be allowed to exist, does the slave population in a state count towards a state's population when determining representation in the House? Please listen to that sentence over again if you need to hear it again. But essentially, this is going to be a situation where the North, obviously, they have lesser amounts of slaves. They don't want to count the slave population as part of a state's population when determining representation, because that's going to really benefit the South over them. And of course, the South is all for it. The North, of course, will argue, well, you aren't counting these people as citizens, so how is that fair for them to count towards your population? But what we get in compromise, because we have to compromise to get the South on board, is the 3/5 compromise, which says that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes and taxation purposes. And what that is referencing is either you could say 3/5 of a person, or that 3/5 of the slave population itself would be counted. The last kind of issue we're going to talk about is central powers versus state powers. Obviously, the Articles of Confederation was a very weak form of government in terms of how much power it gave to the central or federal government. We know we need to increase the power that the central or federal government has, but some states are just not really ready to give up their power yet, and they're just afraid of a strong central government. They don't want it to be too strong. And so how do we find the appropriate balance? And this is where we get the brilliant solution that is the division of power, separation of powers, and checks and balances. So we do need to give the government more power, the central government more power, but we're going to put measures in place to keep each part of our central government in check. And so we have 3 separate branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and judicial. I do kind of expect by this age that y'all understand those 3 branches in terms of like what each branch represents or who it represents. But the system of checks and balances applies to the fact that each branch has power to check another, so that no branch becomes too powerful overall. And this helps to keep the central government in check. The national government would be allowed to impose taxes, regulate trade. This gave it more power than it had under the Articles. And then the last thing I wanted to add about this was that the Founding Fathers included the necessary and proper clause, more commonly known as the elastic clause, which gave some flexibility to the central government, allowing it to grow and change as needed over time. So if there wasn't a power specifically listed in the Constitution, for the central government that they could kind of make a power for themselves if need be. And we'll kind of see examples of this and how the central government has grown throughout our history as a country. All right, write down any questions you have, and I will see y'all tomorrow about them. All right, have a good day.